Case 1. Lehua Kalua. First Circuit Court, Honolulu. August 18, 2021. The disappearance began as a missing person case that would horrify the nation. When Honolulu police received a report on September 13, 2021, about a missing 6-year-old girl named Isabella Kalua, nicknamed Ariel, officers had no idea they were walking into one of Hawaii's most disturbing criminal investigations in recent memory. The adoptive parents, Lehua Kalua and her husband Isaac, reported that little Ariel had vanished from their Waimanalo home during the night. They claimed she'd somehow disappeared without a trace from the bedroom she shared with her siblings. But investigators immediately sensed something wrong. The timeline didn't make sense. The parents' demeanor seemed off. And as detectives dug deeper into the family's history, a nightmare began to emerge from beneath the surface of what neighbors had thought was a loving adoptive home. Authorities quickly determined that Ariel hadn't disappeared on September 13th at all. Evidence suggested the child had actually died approximately 1 month earlier, around mid-August, specifically near August 18, 2021. For nearly 30 days, the Kaluas had allegedly concealed Ariel's death, going about their daily lives while her siblings wondered where their sister had gone. The medical examiner would later work to piece together what happened during those final hours of Ariel's short life. According to court documents and charging papers, the investigation revealed a pattern of escalating abuse. Ariel and her siblings had been adopted by the Kaluas, and what should have been a safe haven had allegedly become a house of horrors. Prosecutors would later present evidence suggesting that Ariel had been confined to her room, deprived of food, and subjected to a bathroom inside a dog cage as punishment. The alleged abuse intensified in the weeks leading up to her death. The charging documents painted a chilling picture. On or around August 18th, according to investigators, Ariel died as a result of the conditions she'd been forced to endure. Rather than call for help or report her death, the Kaluas allegedly took steps to conceal what had happened. They purchased a dog cage large enough to contain a child's body. Security footage from local stores would later allegedly show them making these purchases. They bought duct tape. They bought other materials that prosecutors say were used to hide evidence of their crime. When Ariel's body was finally discovered, it told a story of prolonged suffering. She was severely underweight. Her little body showed signs of malnourishment and neglect. The prosecution's theory, supported by evidence presented to the grand jury, was that Ariel had essentially been starved and confined until her small body simply gave out. And then, rather than face the consequences, her adoptive parents had allegedly stuffed her remains into that dog cage, secured it with duct tape, and hidden the evidence. For 30 days, the Kaluas allegedly maintained a charade. They told Ariel's siblings she'd been sent away. They went to work. They ran errands. They lived their lives. Only when they could no longer maintain the fiction did they finally report her missing, crafting a story about a child who'd vanished in the night. But forensic evidence, witness statements, and the couple's own alleged admissions would eventually unravel their story completely. Both Lehua and Isaac Kalua were arrested and charged with second-degree murder in connection with Ariel's death. The charges also included multiple counts of child abuse for the treatment of Ariel and potentially other children in the home. As the case moved through First Circuit Court in Honolulu, the community struggled to understand how such horror could unfold unnoticed, how a 6-year-old child could suffer so terribly in the very home meant to protect her. Ariel's biological family spoke out, devastated that the adoption meant to give her a better life had instead ended in tragedy. Child welfare services faced intense scrutiny over whether warning signs had been missed, whether check-ins had been thorough enough, whether the system had failed this little girl whose nickname, Ariel, evoked the Disney princess who dreamed of a better world. The case sent shockwaves through Hawaii's adoption and foster care community. It raised urgent questions about oversight, about how adoptive families are monitored, about what safeguards exist to protect the most vulnerable. For the Waimanalo community where the Kaluas had lived, the revelation that such evil had existed behind closed doors, hidden behind the facade of a normal family, was almost incomprehensible. As of the most recent court proceedings, both Lehua and Isaac Kalua remain in custody, facing justice for what prosecutors describe as one of the most heinous cases of child abuse in recent Hawaiian history. Ariel's short life ended in unspeakable tragedy, But her case has galvanized child advocates across the islands to push for stronger protections, better oversight, and more resources to ensure no child suffers as she did. If this case has affected you, please remember that awareness is the first step toward prevention. If you found this information important, don't forget to like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support helps us continue investigating these critical cases and keeping the memory of victims alive. Case 2. Ashley Nihipali. 3rd Circuit Court, Kona. October 31st, 2018. Halloween should have been a night of costumes and candy for 6-year-old Mazin Kanila Nihipali Moniz. Instead, it became the day his young life ended in a Kona home where he'd suffered months of escalating abuse. The call came in to emergency services on October 31st, 2018. A child was unresponsive. Paramedics rushed to the residence, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. Mazin was pronounced dead, his small body bearing the unmistakable evidence of prolonged physical trauma. Ashley Nihipali, the boy's caregiver, would soon face charges that would expose a pattern of abuse so severe that first responders were visibly shaken. This wasn't a tragic accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. According to investigators and prosecutors, Mazin had been subjected to systematic abuse that escalated over time until his body simply could not survive any longer. The investigation into Mazin's death revealed disturbing details about his final months. Medical examiners documented multiple injuries in various stages of healing, indicating repeated trauma over an extended period. Bruising covered significant portions of his body. There were signs of internal injuries. The autopsy findings suggested that Mazin had endured beating after beating, and that adults in the home had failed to seek medical attention even as his condition deteriorated. Neighbors and community members were horrified. Some reported having seen the boy occasionally, but noticed nothing that triggered alarm bells. Others wondered aloud whether there had been signs they'd missed. In tight-knit Hawaiian communities like Kona, where everyone knows everyone, the idea that a child could suffer so terribly without intervention felt like a collective failure. According to charging documents filed in 3rd Circuit Court, Ashley Nihipali was responsible for Mazin's care at the time of his death. Prosecutors alleged that she had subjected the child to repeated physical abuse, including beatings that caused the injuries documented by medical examiners. The most recent assault, they contended, occurred on or shortly before October 31st, resulting in trauma that proved fatal. The case raised immediate questions about whether other adults in the home knew about the abuse. Were there others who witnessed Mazin's suffering and did nothing? Had teachers or other mandated reporters seen warning signs? The investigation expanded to examine everyone who had contact with the boy during his final months, looking for failures in the safety net that should have protected him. Child Protective Services records became a focal point of the investigation. Had there been prior reports? Had anyone called in concerns about Mazin's welfare? The answers would prove critical not just for the criminal case against Nihipali, but for understanding how the system had failed to save this little boy before it was too late. Ashley Nihipali was arrested and charged with manslaughter in connection with Mazin's death. Additional charges related to child abuse and endangerment followed as prosecutors built their case. The legal proceedings would take years to wind through the court system, with pretrial motions, evidence hearings, and the painstaking process of justice moving forward. For Mazin's biological family members, the pain was compounded by the fact that he'd been in someone else's care when he died. They'd entrusted his safety to others, believing he would be protected and loved. Instead, he'd suffered terribly. At memorial services, family members described a bright, loving child who deserved so much better than the fate he'd endured. The Kona community rallied around Mazin's memory. Vigils were held. Blue ribbons, symbolizing child abuse awareness, appeared throughout the neighborhood. Local child advocacy organizations used the case to push for increased funding for prevention programs, better training for mandated reporters, and more resources for Child Protective Services workers who were overwhelmed and understaffed. The prosecution's case relied heavily on medical evidence, on the testimony of first responders who'd seen Mazin's condition, and on any statements Nihipali had made to investigators. Building a timeline of abuse, documenting each injury and its likely cause, required meticulous forensic work. Expert witnesses would be called to explain the injuries to the jury, to describe how they occurred, and to establish that they could not have been accidental. As the case proceeded, it became emblematic of a larger crisis in Hawaii's child welfare system. Reports surfaced of caseworkers carrying impossible caseloads, of families slipping through the cracks, of warning signs that went unheeded because resources were stretched too thin. Mazen's death, tragic and preventable, became a rallying cry for systemic reform. Ashley Nihipali's trial and subsequent legal proceedings brought some measure of accountability, but for those who knew Mazen, no punishment could truly address the magnitude of the loss. A 6-year-old boy with his whole life ahead of him had been failed by the adults meant to protect him, and the community would carry that knowledge forward as a solemn reminder of the cost of inaction. Hawaii's Third Circuit Court ultimately rendered judgment in the case, holding Nihipali accountable for her actions. The sentence handed down reflected the severity of the crime, though many in the community felt no prison term could truly equal the suffering Mazen endured. His case remains a touchstone for child advocates working to prevent future tragedies. This case reminds us why vigilance matters, why we must speak up when we see children in danger. If Mazen's story moved you, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your engagement helps ensure these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Case 3. Sina Pumehana Pili. Third Circuit Court, Hilo. December 22, 2023. The Christmas season was approaching when emergency calls directed first responders to a residence in Hilo on December 22, 2023. An 11-year-old girl, Alicia Pili, was unresponsive. Paramedics worked frantically to revive her, but their efforts were in vain. Alicia was pronounced dead, and the investigation that followed would reveal a tragic pattern of abuse allegedly perpetrated by her mother, Sina Pumehana Pili. 11 years old. An age when children should be thinking about school, friends, hobbies, and upcoming holidays. Instead, Alicia's final days were allegedly marked by suffering at the hands of the person who should have been her greatest protector. The medical examiner's findings painted a grim picture of a child whose body bore evidence of repeated trauma. According to court documents filed in Third Circuit Court, prosecutors alleged that Sina Pili had subjected Alicia to ongoing physical abuse that culminated in the injuries that caused her death. The charging papers described a pattern of violence, of a mother whose treatment of her daughter crossed every line from discipline into criminal abuse. Witnesses who knew the family would later come forward with statements about concerning behaviors they'd observed. The community of Hilo, known for its close-knit neighborhoods and strong family values, reeled from the news. How could a mother allegedly harm her own child so severely? What had gone wrong in this family? Were there warning signs that had been missed? The questions came fast and painful as the reality of Alicia's death sank in. Investigators meticulously documented the scene, collected evidence, and interviewed everyone who had contact with the family. Teachers, relatives, neighbors, anyone who might shed light on what had happened in that home. The investigation revealed that Alicia had allegedly endured abuse for some time before her death, though the exact duration and frequency would become matters of evidence and testimony. Sina Pili was arrested and charged with manslaughter and multiple counts of abuse related to Alicia's death. As she was processed into custody, the legal machinery began its deliberate work. Grand jury proceedings, arraignment, pretrial motions, each step bringing the case closer to resolution, but unable to undo the fundamental tragedy at its heart. For Alicia's extended family, the loss was devastating and complicated. How do you mourn a child while processing that her death allegedly came at her mother's hands? Family members spoke about Alicia's bright smile, her love of certain activities, the potential that had been stolen from her. They struggled with guilt, wondering if they could have done something, anything, to intervene before it was too late. The prosecution's case would rely on medical evidence establishing cause of death, on documentation of prior injuries, if any existed, and on building a timeline showing the alleged abuse. Expert witnesses in child abuse pediatrics would likely be called to explain injury patterns to the jury. The defense would have its opportunity to challenge the evidence, to present alternative explanations if any existed, to ensure that Sina Pili received a fair trial even as the community's anger burned hot. Child Protective Services came under scrutiny once again. Had there been prior referrals involving this family? Had anyone reported concerns about Alicia's welfare? The agency's records would be examined for any indication that the system had awareness of risk factors and failed to act. Each such revelation added to the public's growing frustration with a child welfare system that seemed perpetually overwhelmed. The case sparked conversations across Hawaii about mandatory reporting, about what signs teachers and coaches and other adults should watch for, about how to create environments where children feel safe disclosing abuse. Child advocacy centers expanded their community outreach, teaching parents and professionals alike how to recognize warning signs and what to do when they suspect a child is in danger. As Sina Pili's case moved through the court system, prosecutors sought to hold her fully accountable for Lehua's death. The charges carried significant prison time, reflecting the severity of allegedly taking a child's life through abuse. The trial process would be long and painful, requiring family members to relive the trauma, to hear details they wished they didn't know, to face the reality of what had allegedly happened to their beloved Lehua. The community held memorials for Lehua. Classmates created artwork in her honor. Teachers shared memories of a student whose life had been cut short just as she was beginning to discover who she might become. The grief rippled outward, touching everyone who had known her, everyone who heard her story, everyone who understood that her death represented a failure to protect a vulnerable child. The legal proceedings in Third Circuit Court eventually brought resolution in the form of a verdict and sentence, though the emotional toll on the community would persist long after the courtroom doors closed. Lehua's case joined the growing list of Hawaiian child abuse tragedies that demanded systemic change, that required communities to confront uncomfortable truths about violence hidden behind closed doors. For those working in child protection, Lehua's death served as a painful reminder of what's at stake when the system fails. Every missed opportunity to intervene, every report that goes uninvestigated or underfollowed, every worker too overwhelmed to make that extra home visit. These aren't just bureaucratic failures. They're children's lives hanging in the balance. Remember Lehua's name. Remember that she deserved better. If her story compels you to learn more about child protection, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Awareness and education are our best tools for preventing future tragedies. Case 4, Janae Perez. First Circuit Court, Honolulu. June 13, 2024. The Kapolei neighborhood seemed like any other suburban community on the island of Oahu. Families coming and going, children playing, the rhythm of everyday life. But behind the doors of one residence, 3-year-old Sarai Perez Rivera was allegedly suffering from severe neglect and starvation that would ultimately claim her young life on June 13, 2024. When emergency responders arrived at the home, they found Sarai unresponsive. Efforts to revive the toddler failed. She was pronounced dead, and the investigation that immediately followed would uncover conditions so appalling that even seasoned investigators were shocked. This wasn't a case of a sudden medical emergency or an unfortunate accident. According to prosecutors, Sarai had been systematically starved, denied the most basic necessities of life, until her small body simply shut down. Janae Perez, Sarai's mother, was arrested along with her partner Ashley Utley. The charges they would face painted a horrific picture of willful neglect. Prosecutors alleged that both women had withheld food from Sarai, that they'd failed to provide basic medical care, that they'd watched this child waste away without intervening. The medical examiner's findings would support these allegations, documenting severe malnourishment and a body weight far below what a healthy 3-year-old should weigh. 3 years old, an age of curious questions, of learning and growing, of boundless energy. Sarai should have been thriving, developing, exploring her world. Instead, according to the charges, she'd been confined and neglected, her most basic needs ignored by the people responsible for her care. The autopsy revealed organs that had begun to fail, a body consuming itself in the absence of adequate nutrition. The investigation expanded to examine how this could have happened unnoticed. Did Sarai attend daycare? Had she been seen by pediatricians? Were there relatives who'd noticed her condition? Each question led to more disturbing answers about isolation, about a child kept away from people who might have intervened, about warning signs that either weren't seen or weren't reported. Prosecutors in First Circuit Court built their case methodically. They documented the timeline of Sarai's decline, using medical records, if any existed, and expert testimony to establish that her condition resulted from prolonged nutritional deprivation. They examined the home where she'd lived, looking for evidence of food access or lack thereof. They interviewed anyone who'd had contact with the family, searching for corroboration of their theory that this was willful starvation, not accidental neglect. The community of Kapolei was shaken. Neighbors expressed disbelief that such a thing could happen so close to their own homes. Some recalled seeing Perez and Utley, but not noticing the child. Others wondered if they'd seen something that should have raised alarm, but hadn't recognized it at the time. The collective guilt and horror would take time to process. For Sarai's extended family, the news brought unbearable grief. They'd lost a precious little girl, and the circumstances of her death made the mourning exponentially more painful. Questions haunted them. Could they have done more? Should they have checked in more frequently? Had there been a moment when intervention might have saved Sarai's life? Both Janae Perez and Ashley Utley were charged with manslaughter and abuse, facing significant prison time if convicted. The prosecution's case would likely include testimony from medical examiners, child abuse pediatricians, and possibly child protective services workers if there had been any prior involvement with the family. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence and present alternative explanations, though the physical evidence of Sarai's condition would be difficult to dispute. The case highlighted gaps in Hawaii's child welfare safety net. How does a 3-year-old child starve to death without anyone noticing? What system should have caught this? The answers pointed to a combination of factors, including possible social isolation of the family, lack of regular medical care for Sarai, and perhaps warning signs that were seen but not reported by people who encountered the child. Child advocacy groups seized on Sarai's case to push for legislative changes. They called for mandatory wellness checks for children not enrolled in school or daycare. They advocated for better training for pediatricians and emergency room staff to recognize signs of abuse and neglect. They demanded more funding for child protective services to reduce caseloads and improve response times to referrals. As the legal process moved forward, the courtroom became a place where Sarai's short life was examined in painful detail. Evidence photos, medical testimony, expert analysis, all piecing together the story of how a 3-year-old came to die of starvation in the year 2024 in a developed nation with abundant resources. The injustice of it, the preventability of it, hung heavy over every hearing. The trial, when it came, would force the community to confront uncomfortable realities about domestic violence, about substance abuse issues if they played a role, about mental health crises that go untreated, about all the societal failures that converge to put children at risk. Sarai's death wasn't just about 2 individuals who allegedly committed terrible acts. It was about systemic gaps that allowed those acts to occur undetected. Ultimately, the First Circuit Court would render judgment, holding Janae Perez accountable for her alleged role in Sarai's death. The sentence would reflect the severity of allowing a child to starve, though no punishment could restore the life that was lost or ease the pain of those who loved Sarai. Her case would join others as a catalyst for reform, a terrible example of why child protection must be a community priority. Sarai Perez Rivera's name deserves to be remembered. Her story demands our attention and action. If you believe in protecting vulnerable children, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour to help spread awareness about these critical issues. Case 5, Brandy Blas. First Circuit Court, Waimanalo. January 18, 2024. The emergency call came in to Honolulu Police on January 18, 2024, directing first responders to a residence on Karsten Drive in Waimanalo. A 10-year-old girl, Geanna Bradley, was unresponsive. When paramedics arrived and began their assessment, they immediately recognized this wasn't a typical medical emergency. The child's condition told a story of prolonged suffering, and the scene inside the home would reveal one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse Hawaii had witnessed in recent memory. Geanna was pronounced dead, and what investigators discovered next would lead to murder charges against 3 adults. Brandy Blas, age 35, her husband Thomas Blas, age 40, and Brandy's mother Deborah Jaron, age 67. All 3 lived in the home where Geanna had spent the last 8 years of her short life, having been placed in their care when she was just 2 or 3 years old. What should have been a safe, loving guardianship had allegedly become a house of horrors where a child was systematically tortured until her body could endure no more. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. Geanna had died from a combination of starvation, blunt force injuries, prolonged physical restraint, pneumonia, and medical neglect. Her body told the story of months, perhaps years, of escalating abuse. She was severely malnourished, her weight far below what a healthy 10-year-old should be. There were signs of repeated physical trauma. Part of her nose bridge was missing. And perhaps most horrifying, when first responders found her, Geanna's arms were bound to her torso with duct tape, with additional tape wrapped around her eyes and head. As investigators processed the scene, the full scope of the abuse became clear. Geanna hadn't been sleeping in a bed like a normal child. According to evidence gathered at the scene, she'd been forced to sleep in a small box, confined like an animal rather than treated as a human being. She wasn't allowed to use the family bathroom. Instead, she'd been given a bucket to use as a toilet, denied even basic dignity in her daily life. The conditions she'd endured were beyond comprehension for a child who should have been in 5th grade, making friends, and discovering her interests. The investigation revealed that Geanna had been in the Blas family's custody since she was a toddler, approximately 8 years of care that had somehow transformed from whatever it began as into systematic torture. Neighbors who'd lived on Karsten Drive for years struggled to recall seeing Geanna recently. Some remembered a little girl years ago but couldn't recall when they'd last spotted her outside playing or coming and going with the family. The isolation had been deliberate, investigators believed, a way to hide what was happening behind closed doors. One critical detail emerged that would prompt intense scrutiny of oversight systems. Geanna had been pulled from school in October 2022, allegedly for homeschooling. From that point forward, she'd been completely removed from the one environment where teachers, counselors, and other mandated reporters might have noticed signs of abuse. The withdrawal from school effectively made Geanna invisible to the systems designed to protect children, leaving her alone with her abusers without any external monitoring or support. When police executed search warrants on the defendant's electronic devices, they discovered disturbing images and videos that allegedly documented the abuse Geanna had suffered. These files would become crucial evidence in building the prosecution's case, providing a timeline of mistreatment and establishing that all 3 adults in the home had knowledge of and participation in what was happening to this child. The existence of such documentation suggested a level of calculation and cruelty that deepened the horror of the case. The investigation expanded when authorities examined the couple's 4-year-old adopted son. Medical evaluations revealed that he too showed signs of abuse and what doctors termed failure to thrive, a condition where children don't develop normally due to inadequate nutrition or care. While this younger child had survived, his condition suggested that the abuse wasn't limited to Geanna, that the household represented danger to any vulnerable child placed there. He was immediately removed from the home and placed in protective custody. All 3 defendants, Brandy Blas, Thomas Blas, and Deborah Jaron, were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The charges carried the possibility of life in prison without parole, reflecting the severity of allegedly causing a child's death through prolonged abuse and neglect. Additional charges related to the abuse of the 4-year-old and other offenses would follow as prosecutors built their comprehensive case. The Wahiawa community, a close-knit area in central Oahu, reeled from the revelations. Karsten Drive seemed like any other residential street, with families raising children, neighbors greeting each other, the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. The idea that such extreme abuse had been occurring in their midst, that a child had been suffering so terribly just houses away, was almost impossible to process. Vigils were held for Geanna. Blue ribbons appeared throughout the neighborhood. Residents struggled with guilt about whether they'd missed signs or could have done something to save her. For Geanna's biological family, the news brought devastating grief compounded by profound guilt. They believed she would be safe in the guardianship placement, that she would have opportunities and stability they perhaps couldn't provide when she was a toddler. Instead, she'd endured years of torture before dying alone and afraid. The betrayal of trust was absolute, the weight of what-ifs unbearable. They'd lost precious years with Geanna, years when they might have noticed something was wrong if they'd had regular contact. Child Protective Services faced intense scrutiny. How had Geanna been placed with the Blas family initially? What screening and background checks had been conducted? More critically, had there been any follow-up visits or monitoring during the 8 years she was in their care? The withdrawal from school in October 2022 should have triggered oversight, checks to ensure homeschooling was actually occurring and the child was safe. Questions mounted about whether the system had simply lost track of Geanna, allowing her to slip through cracks that became her tomb. The educational system also faced difficult questions. When Geanna was pulled from school claiming homeschool, what verification process existed? Did anyone from the school follow up to ensure she was actually receiving education? In many jurisdictions, homeschool oversight is minimal, creating opportunities for parents to isolate and abuse children away from mandatory reporters. Geanna's case became a rallying point for advocates demanding stronger homeschool monitoring and regular wellness checks for children withdrawn from traditional school settings. As the case moved through First Circuit Court, prosecutors methodically built their murder case. The medical evidence documenting starvation and trauma was powerful. The photographs and videos allegedly found on the defendant's phones would provide direct evidence of abuse. Expert witnesses would explain how the various injuries and conditions developed, establishing the prolonged nature of the suffering. The prosecution's goal was to prove beyond reasonable doubt that all 3 defendants knowingly participated in abuse that caused Geanna's death. The defense attorneys for Brandy Blas, Thomas Blas, and Deborah Jaron faced the difficult task of representing clients accused of horrific crimes against a child. They would examine the evidence, challenge the prosecution's timeline and causation theories, and ensure their clients received fair trials. In cases this emotionally charged, protecting defendants' constitutional rights becomes even more critical, ensuring that convictions result from solid evidence rather than community outrage. The legal proceedings would be lengthy and complex, with 3 defendants potentially having different levels of involvement and culpability. Prosecutors would need to establish what each person knew, what each person did, and how their actions contributed to Geanna's death. Were all 3 equally involved in the physical abuse? Did one person dominate the household while others failed to intervene? These questions would affect charging decisions, plea negotiations, and potential sentencing if convictions were secured. Mental health experts might be called to evaluate the defendants, exploring what psychological factors could lead 3 adults to torture a child. The presence of Deborah Jaron, the grandmother, added another disturbing dimension. Grandparents are often seen as protective figures, yet here was a woman allegedly participating in her granddaughter's abuse. Understanding the family dynamics, the power structures, and the psychological elements would be important for both the criminal case and for broader lessons about preventing such abuse. For the 4-year-old boy removed from the home, the future meant intensive therapeutic support and a new, safe placement. He'd witnessed or experienced abuse during his formative years, trauma that would require specialized care to address. Finding an appropriate permanent home for a child with such significant needs would be challenging but critical. His survival, while fortunate, came with the heavy burden of early childhood trauma that would affect his development for years. Child advocacy organizations across Hawaii seized on Geanna's case to demand systemic reforms. They called for mandatory annual wellness checks for all homeschooled children. They advocated for better funding and smaller caseloads for Child Protective Services workers. They pushed for criminal penalties for agencies or individuals who failed to properly monitor vulnerable children. Geanna's death, they argued, represented preventable tragedy that demanded accountability and change. As of the most recent court proceedings, the case against Brandy Blas, Thomas Blas, and Deborah Jaron remains ongoing. They face life in prison without the possibility of parole if convicted of second-degree murder. The trial process will be emotionally devastating for everyone involved, requiring the community to confront the worst of human cruelty while seeking justice for a child who suffered unimaginably. Geanna Bradley was 10 years old when she died. She'd spent 8 of those 10 years in a home where she was allegedly starved, beaten, restrained, and denied the most basic human dignity. She never got to experience her teenage years, never graduated from elementary school, never had the chance to discover who she might become. Her life was stolen by the people entrusted with her care and the community that failed to see her suffering in time. The case stands as perhaps the most horrific example of guardianship abuse in recent Hawaiian history. It exposes every weakness in the child welfare system: inadequate screening, insufficient monitoring, failure to track children withdrawn from school, and the ease with which abusers can isolate victims from potential help. Geanna's death demands we do better, that we strengthen every link in the chain meant to protect vulnerable children. Her name should be remembered. Her suffering should galvanize action. And her case should serve as a permanent reminder that protecting children requires constant vigilance, adequate resources, and a community commitment to speaking up when something seems wrong. Every child deserves to be seen, to be safe, to have adults who will fight for their well-being. If Geanna's story moves you to action, if you believe in protecting every child, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your engagement helps us continue covering these critical cases and pushing for the changes needed to prevent future tragedies. Case 6. Holly Kaleki White. 3rd Circuit Court, Papaiku. February 12, 2024. The call to police came in as a welfare check request on February 12, 2024. Concerned parties had reported possible abuse at a residence near Mill Road in the Papaiku area of Hawaii Island. When officers arrived and began their investigation, what they discovered would lead to assault charges against Holly Kaleki White for alleged abuse of her 2 young sons. Unlike some of the other cases in this series where children died from their injuries, the intervention in White's case came before tragedy could strike. The welfare check, triggered by someone who recognized warning signs and took action, potentially saved these children from escalating violence. It stands as a reminder that early reporting can make the difference between a child who survives and one who doesn't. According to police reports filed with 3rd Circuit Court, officers who responded to the February 12th welfare check found evidence of physical abuse. The children, both boys, showed signs of having been struck or otherwise physically harmed. Medical examinations would later document the extent of their injuries, providing evidence to support criminal charges against their mother. Holly White was arrested and charged with assault and child abuse related to the treatment of her sons. The specific allegations detailed in charging documents described acts of violence against children too young to defend themselves, abuse that crossed the line from permissible discipline into criminal assault. The boys were removed from White's custody, pending the outcome of the criminal case and family court proceedings. For the small community of Papaiku, the case hit close to home. Neighbors who'd seen White and her children in passing now wondered what had been happening inside that house. Some felt guilty for not having been more observant, for not having questioned bruises or behavior changes they might have noticed but dismissed. Others praised the person who'd made the welfare check request, recognizing that their intervention may have saved these children from worse harm. The investigation examined not just the February 12th incident, but the broader pattern of White's behavior toward her sons. Had there been prior abuse? Were these isolated incidents or part of an ongoing problem? Child Protective Services records were reviewed for any previous referrals or investigations involving the family. The goal was to build a complete picture of the environment in which these children had been living. Prosecutors prepared their case for trial, gathering medical evidence, witness statements, and any other documentation that would establish what happened to these boys. Expert witnesses might be called to explain injury patterns, to distinguish between accidental childhood injuries and those that result from abuse. The children themselves, depending on their ages, might provide testimony about what they'd experienced, though courts are always careful to balance the need for evidence against the trauma of requiring children to testify. Holly White's defense attorneys would have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's evidence, to present alternative explanations for the children's injuries, if any existed, to ensure their client received a fair trial. The adversarial system, even in cases involving child abuse, requires both sides to be fully represented and all evidence to be rigorously tested before a conviction can be secured. The case raised important questions about what resources had been available to White, whether she'd sought help for parenting challenges, whether mental health or substance abuse issues had contributed to her alleged actions. Understanding these contextual factors doesn't excuse abuse, but it can help communities develop better prevention strategies and support systems for struggling families. Child advocates pointed to White's case as an example of why mandatory reporting laws are so critical. Someone saw something concerning, reported it, and potentially saved these children from ongoing harm or worse. The system worked in this instance because an aware citizen took responsibility for calling in their concerns. Not every case ends with such timely intervention. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the focus shifted to both accountability and the children's future. While White faced criminal consequences for her alleged actions, family court proceedings would determine permanent custody arrangements for the boys. Would they be returned to their mother if she completed certain programs? Would they be placed with relatives? The answers would depend on risk assessments and what the court determined served the children's best interests. The boys themselves faced the challenge of healing from both physical and emotional trauma. Abuse by a parent creates deep psychological wounds that persist long after visible injuries heal. They would need counseling, stable placement, and support to process what they'd experienced and build healthy attachments going forward. The long-term impact of childhood abuse can shape entire lives, affecting relationships, mental health, and future parenting. Community organizations in the Papaiku area used White's case to promote awareness about child abuse warning signs. They distributed information about how to report suspected abuse, about what mandated reporters should watch for, about resources available to families in crisis. Prevention requires education, and every case offers lessons about how to better protect vulnerable children. The Third Circuit Court ultimately resolved White's criminal case, imposing whatever sentence the law and evidence warranted. Whether that meant prison time, probation, mandatory treatment, or some combination depended on the specific findings and the judge's assessment of both punishment and rehabilitation needs. The goal extended beyond mere punishment to reducing the likelihood of future harm. For the two boys at the center of this case, their mother's arrest represented both trauma and intervention. They'd experienced abuse at her hands, but also saw the system step in to protect them. How they would process these experiences, what messages they would internalize about safety and trust, would shape their development for years to come. The hope was that early intervention had given them a chance at healing that children in other cases never received. Holly White's case reminds us that awareness and action can prevent the worst outcomes. If this story motivates you to learn more about recognizing and reporting child abuse, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Community vigilance saves lives. Case 7. Lahiki Caitlyn Fujio Judd. Family Court and Circuit Court. Location based on case documentation. Events documented through March 2024 and beyond. The case of Lahiki Caitlyn Fujio Judd unfolded over months, with allegations of severe neglect and physical abuse of her young daughter coming to light through various reports and court filings in early 2024. Unlike sudden violent incidents, this case represented ongoing systemic failure to provide basic care, with the abuse documented through medical examinations, witness statements, and the child's own condition when authorities finally intervened. Reports that surfaced in March 2024 detailed shocking conditions. According to documentation that would later be presented in court, Judd's daughter had been subjected to severe neglect that affected her physical development and health. The child was allegedly denied adequate nutrition, lived in unsanitary conditions, and suffered from untreated medical issues that should have prompted immediate intervention. When medical professionals finally examined her, they found evidence of prolonged deprivation. The investigation revealed that warning signs had existed for some time before official intervention occurred. Teachers or child care providers may have noticed developmental delays or concerning hygiene issues. Medical appointments may have been missed, preventing routine detection of abuse. The timeline of when concerns first arose and when action was finally taken would become an important part of understanding how the system had failed to protect this child earlier. Lahiki Judd was charged with multiple counts of child abuse and neglect based on the conditions in which her daughter had been living. Court documents described a pattern of failing to provide basic necessities, of ignoring the child's obvious needs, of creating an environment that endangered her health and development. The charges reflected the severity and duration of the alleged neglect, carrying potential penalties that included significant prison time. Court hearings throughout 2024 brought the case into public view. Media coverage focused attention on the details of the daughter's condition, on what she'd endured, and on questions about why intervention hadn't come sooner. The community struggled to understand how a child could suffer such neglect in plain sight, how systems designed to catch these cases had apparently missed the warning signs until the situation became critical. Child Protective Services' involvement in the case prompted scrutiny of their handling of any prior referrals. Had there been calls about this family before? If so, what had been done in response? Were there documented visits that failed to detect the severity of the neglect? These questions were essential both for the criminal case and for broader efforts to improve child welfare systems. Every failure to act represented a missed opportunity to prevent suffering. The prosecution built its case on medical evidence documenting the daughter's condition, on expert testimony about the effects of severe neglect on child development, and on witness statements from people who'd observed the child or the home environment. Photographs and medical records would paint a vivid picture of what this little girl had endured, making it difficult for jurors or judges to dismiss the severity of the charges. Lahiki Judd's defense would need to address powerful evidence of neglect. Defense attorneys might raise questions about Judd's mental health, her own background and trauma, her capacity to provide care. While these factors wouldn't excuse the abuse, they might provide context that affected sentencing if she was convicted. The court system tries to balance accountability with understanding the complex factors that sometimes contribute to abuse. The daughter at the center of this case faced a long road to recovery. Severe neglect affects children physically, emotionally, and developmentally. She would need medical care to address health issues caused by malnutrition and lack of treatment. She would need therapeutic support to process trauma. She would need stable, nurturing placement to begin rebuilding the sense of safety and security that had been stolen from her. The work of healing would take years. Extended family members grappled with complex emotions. Some blamed themselves for not intervening sooner. Others felt angry at systems that should have protected their relative's child. All struggled with the reality that someone in their family had allegedly inflicted such harm. The ripple effects of child abuse extend far beyond the immediate victim, touching everyone connected to the family. Community advocates used Judd's case to highlight the distinction between poverty and neglect. Families struggling financially may lack resources, but that's different from willfully neglecting a child's basic needs. The question becomes whether parents sought available help, whether they tried to access services, whether their failure to provide care resulted from inability or from unwillingness. This distinction matters in determining appropriate intervention and support. As court proceedings continued, the focus remained on both justice for what the daughter had endured and ensuring she would be safe going forward. Criminal prosecution addressed accountability for past abuse. Family court proceedings determined custody and placement. Child welfare agencies developed plans to monitor her well-being and provide necessary services. All these parallel processes aimed at the same goal, protecting this child from further harm. The case eventually reached resolution in the court system, with Judd facing consequences for her alleged actions. Whether through trial or plea agreement, the legal process imposed accountability while also considering what outcome best served the child's long-term interests. Sometimes justice means maximum punishment. Other times it means structured rehabilitation with ongoing monitoring. Courts must weigh these factors in every case. For the daughter, her mother's prosecution represented both validation that what happened to her was wrong and the complicated reality that the person who harmed her was also the person she'd looked to for love and care. Children in these situations often have conflicted feelings about seeing parents punished, loving them while also needing protection from them. Therapy helps children navigate these complex emotions. Lahiki Judd's case stands as another reminder that child abuse often happens gradually, that warning signs accumulate over time, that early intervention can prevent escalation. The community's failure wasn't a single missed moment, but a series of opportunities not taken, concerns not voiced, systems not responding quickly enough. Learning from these failures is how we improve protection for future children at risk. Every child deserves to be seen and protected. If this case reinforces that belief for you, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your engagement helps us continue shining light on these important stories. Case 8. Calla Weddington. 3rd Circuit Court, Pahoa. May 31, 2023. The incident in Pahoa on May 31, 2023, began as a domestic disturbance that rapidly escalated into a violent confrontation involving police and ultimately led to serious injury of Weddington's 9-year-old daughter. What started as a call about a family dispute became a standoff situation that endangered multiple lives and revealed serious concerns about Calla Weddington's mental state and her daughter's safety. According to police reports and subsequent court filings, officers responded to the residence and encountered an increasingly volatile situation. Weddington allegedly became combative, creating a dangerous environment for both law enforcement and her young daughter. The confrontation escalated to the point where force became necessary to bring the situation under control, but in the chaos, the 9-year-old child sustained injuries. The exact sequence of events would be reconstructed through police reports, witness statements, and any available video evidence. What was clear from the outset was that a child had been harmed in a situation created by her mother's alleged actions. Whether the injuries resulted directly from Weddington's behavior or were an indirect consequence of the violent confrontation she allegedly created, she bore legal responsibility for placing her daughter in harm's way. Calla Weddington was arrested at the scene and subsequently charged with assault, child endangerment, and potentially other offenses related to her confrontation with police and the injury to her daughter. The charges reflected the multiple victims of her alleged actions, the child who was hurt, the officers who faced violence, and the broader community endangered by the incident. For the 9-year-old daughter, the trauma extended beyond physical injuries. She'd witnessed her mother in crisis, had been caught in a violent situation, and had ultimately seen her mother arrested and taken away. The psychological impact of such experiences on children can be profound, affecting their sense of safety, their relationship with their parent, and their general emotional well-being. She would need supportive services to process what she'd experienced. The Pahoa community, which had witnessed the incident unfold or heard about it shortly after, struggled to make sense of what had happened. Neighbors who knew Weddington and her daughter wondered what had triggered such an extreme response. Had there been previous incidents? Were there mental health issues that had gone untreated? The questions pointed to broader concerns about support systems for families in crisis. Investigators examined Weddington's background, looking for context that might explain her actions. Were there documented mental health issues? Had she been under unusual stress? Were there substance abuse factors? Understanding what led to the May 31st incident was important both for the criminal case and for determining what interventions might prevent future violence. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on police testimony about what they'd witnessed and experienced during the confrontation. Medical evidence documenting the daughter's injuries would establish the harm caused. Any statements Weddington made during or after the incident might be used to show her state of mind and her awareness of the danger she was creating. Calla Weddington's defense attorneys would need to address the serious charges while potentially raising mental health concerns as mitigating factors. If Weddington had been experiencing a psychiatric crisis, that wouldn't excuse harming her daughter or attacking police, but it might affect how the court approached sentencing and what kind of treatment or monitoring would be required going forward. The case highlighted the intersection of mental health crisis and child endangerment. When parents experience psychiatric emergencies, children are often collateral victims. Police responding to such situations must balance public safety with the recognition that they're often dealing with someone in medical crisis. The daughter caught in the middle of Weddington's breakdown paid a price for a situation she had no control over. Child Protective Services became involved immediately following the incident, conducting their own assessment of the daughter's safety and determining appropriate placement while the criminal case proceeded. The child's well-being had to be prioritized regardless of what happened to her mother criminally. Family members were likely contacted about possible kinship placement, offering the daughter stability with relatives she knew while her mother's case was resolved. As the legal proceedings moved through Third Circuit Court, the focus remained on accountability for the May 31st incident and ensuring the daughter's ongoing safety. Court-ordered mental health evaluation and treatment for Weddington might be part of any resolution, recognizing that punishment alone wouldn't address underlying issues that contributed to the dangerous situation she'd created. The daughter's recovery would involve both physical healing from her injuries and emotional processing of the trauma. 9 years old is an age where children understand what's happening but may not have the emotional tools to cope with such extreme stress. Therapeutic support, stable placement, and consistent care would be essential to help her work through what she'd experienced and rebuild a sense of safety. For the responding officers, the incident represented the kind of difficult, dangerous situation they face when family crises turn violent. Their training in crisis intervention and de-escalation was tested, and regardless of the outcome, they'd been forced into a situation where a child was hurt. The psychological impact on first responders who witness children harmed in the line of duty is significant and often overlooked. The Third Circuit Court ultimately resolved Weddington's case, imposing whatever consequences and requirements the evidence and circumstances warranted. Whether she faced prison time, intensive probation with mandated treatment, or some other outcome depended on the specifics of her criminal history, mental health status, and the court's assessment of risk to her daughter and community. Calla Weddington's case serves as a reminder that mental health crisis can quickly escalate to child endangerment, that systems must be better at intervening before situations reach the breaking point. If this story underscores the importance of mental health support and child protection, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour to help us continue covering these critical issues. Case 9. Alicia Jean Nakamura. Third Circuit Court, Puna. July 21st and 23rd, 2023. The streets of Puna on Hawaii's Big Island are typically quiet, with residential neighborhoods where children play and families go about their daily lives. But on July 21st, 2023, a passerby encountered a scene that would lead to the arrest of 38-year-old Alicia Jean Nakamura and expose the terrifying abuse her 4-year-old daughter had been enduring. A small child, just 4 years old, was found alone in the street, visibly frightened and in distress. When concerned adults approached to help, the little girl's story would reveal a nightmare unfolding behind closed doors. The child was scared, crying, and desperately trying to explain what had happened to her. In the simple language of a 4-year-old, she told the adults who'd stopped to help that her mother had hurt her. But this wasn't a description of appropriate discipline or an accidental injury. According to what the child reported, her mother had assaulted her, and most terrifyingly, had squeezed her neck so tightly that she couldn't breathe. The thought of a mother choking her own toddler, of a 4-year-old gasping for air while the person meant to protect her cut off her oxygen, was almost too horrific to comprehend. A 74-year-old woman in the area, horrified by what she was witnessing and hearing, attempted to intervene to protect the child. Her compassion and bravery in stepping forward to help would come at a cost. According to police reports, Alicia Nakamura became violent toward this elderly Good Samaritan, assaulting the woman who'd tried to help her daughter. The attack on someone nearly twice her age, someone simply trying to protect a vulnerable child, demonstrated the volatility and danger that Nakamura represented not just to her daughter, but to the community at large. Police were called to the scene and arrived to find the frightened 4-year-old, the injured elderly woman, and Alicia Nakamura. Officers immediately began their investigation, interviewing witnesses, examining the child for visible injuries, and taking statements about what had occurred. The little girl's account of being choked by her mother was deeply concerning, as strangulation is one of the most dangerous forms of assault, potentially causing death or serious brain injury even when victims survive the immediate attack. When officers arrested Nakamura on July 21st, they discovered she was in possession of methamphetamine, adding drug charges to the mounting allegations against her. The presence of illegal drugs provided important context for understanding the situation. Methamphetamine use can lead to paranoia, aggression, and impaired judgment, all factors that may have contributed to Nakamura's violent behavior toward both her daughter and the elderly woman who intervened. However, substance abuse, while it might explain behavior, never excuses child abuse or assault. Medical professionals examined the 4-year-old girl, documenting the injuries she'd sustained. What they found went beyond the choking incident that had precipitated the call to police. According to court documents filed in Third Circuit Court, the child had multiple injuries consistent with abuse. These physical findings corroborated her account of being hurt by her mother and suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. The pattern of injuries indicated the child had likely suffered repeated abuse over time, with the July 21st event being simply the moment when the violence spilled out into public view. Based on the medical evidence and the child's statements, prosecutors added felony abuse charges to the initial counts against Nakamura. By July 23, 2023, when she was formally processed into the criminal justice system, she faced serious charges including assault of her daughter, assault of the elderly woman, drug possession, and felony child abuse. Each charge carried significant potential prison time, and taken together, they painted a picture of a deeply troubled woman whose behavior endangered everyone around her, especially her defenseless 4-year-old. The Puna community rallied around both the child and the brave elderly woman who tried to protect her. In many neighborhoods, people hesitate to intervene in what they perceive as family matters, afraid of overstepping or creating conflict. But this 74-year-old woman had seen a child in danger and acted without hesitation, even at personal cost. Her courage provided a powerful example of the community responsibility we all share to protect vulnerable children, regardless of the risks involved. For the 4-year-old at the center of this case, the trauma extended far beyond physical injuries. Imagine being 4 years old, dependent on your mother for everything, and having that mother choke you until you can't breathe. The terror of that moment, the betrayal of trust, the confusion about why the person who's supposed to love you most is hurting you. These psychological wounds can last a lifetime. The child would need extensive therapeutic support to process what she'd experienced and to learn that not all adults would harm her. Child Protective Services immediately removed the girl from Nakamura's custody following the arrest. She was placed in protective care, either with relatives if safe options existed or in foster placement if necessary. The priority was ensuring she was in an environment where she could begin healing, where adults would nurture rather than harm her, where she could start to rebuild the sense of safety that had been shattered by her mother's abuse. The investigation examined Nakamura's background and the circumstances that had led to this crisis. Were there prior Child Protective Services referrals involving this family? Had anyone reported concerns about the child's welfare before? Were there other incidents of domestic violence or substance abuse in Nakamura's history? Understanding the full context was important both for the criminal case and for preventing similar situations in other families struggling with addiction and violence. Prosecutors preparing the case against Alicia Nakamura had strong evidence to work with. They had the child's statements about being choked. They had medical documentation of injuries. They had witnesses who'd seen the assault on the elderly woman. They had the methamphetamine found during arrest. And they had the pattern of abuse evidenced by multiple injuries on a 4-year-old child. The challenge would be presenting this evidence in a way that ensured justice while protecting the young victim from additional trauma. Defense attorneys representing Nakamura would need to address the serious charges while potentially raising issues of mental health and substance abuse as context, though not excuse, for her behavior. If Nakamura was in the grip of methamphetamine addiction, treatment might be part of any resolution to the case. If she had untreated mental health issues, those would need addressing. But regardless of mitigating factors, she would need to be held accountable for choking her daughter and for the other acts of violence she'd allegedly committed. The case highlighted the intersection of substance abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. These issues often overlap, with children becoming collateral victims when parents struggle with addiction or untreated mental illness. Methamphetamine use in particular is associated with increased aggression and paranoia that can make users dangerous to those around them, especially vulnerable children who depend on them for care. Community advocates used Nakamura's case to push for increased resources for substance abuse treatment, particularly for parents. Early intervention programs that provide treatment and support before addiction leads to child abuse could prevent cases like this one. But such programs require funding, political will, and a commitment to viewing addiction as a public health issue rather than purely a criminal matter. The goal is protecting children while also addressing the root causes that put them at risk. As the legal proceedings moved through Third Circuit Court, the focus remained on both accountability and the child's future. Nakamura faced serious prison time if convicted on all charges. More importantly, she would likely lose parental rights, ensuring that the daughter she'd abused would not be returned to her custody. Family court proceedings parallel to the criminal case would determine permanent placement for the child, prioritizing her safety and well-being above all other considerations. For the 4-year-old victim, her mother's arrest represented both trauma and rescue. She'd lost the parent she depended on, even though that parent had been hurting her. Children in these situations often have conflicted feelings, loving their abusive parent while also needing protection from them. Therapists working with the child would help her process these complex emotions, helping her understand that her mother's actions were wrong while not making her feel guilty for whatever feelings she still had. The elderly woman who intervened, despite being assaulted for her efforts, had potentially saved this child's life. If the choking had continued, if the violence had escalated, the 4-year-old might not have survived. By stepping in when she saw danger, by being willing to get involved rather than looking away, this brave woman had given the child a chance at a safer future. Her actions embodied the kind of community responsibility that protects vulnerable children. The case also served as a reminder about the importance of bystander intervention. Too often, people witness concerning situations involving children but hesitate to act, uncertain whether it's their place to intervene. Alicia Nakamura's case demonstrated that sometimes intervention, even at personal risk, is exactly what's needed to save a child from ongoing harm. The 74-year-old woman's courage should inspire others to speak up and act when they see children in danger. As of the most recent court proceedings, Nakamura's case continued through the judicial system. The outcome would depend on the evidence, on any plea negotiations, and on the court's assessment of her culpability and the appropriate consequences. What was certain was that her 4-year-old daughter was safer away from her, that intervention had come before the worst could happen, and that the system had responded to protect a vulnerable child from further harm. Alicia Jean Nakamura's case reminds us that child abuse can happen anywhere, that substance abuse and violence often endanger children, and that community members who notice and act can make the difference between life and death. The 4-year-old girl at the center of this case survived because someone cared enough to help, because the system responded, and because intervention came in time. If this story inspires you to be vigilant in protecting children in your community, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support helps us continue covering these critical cases and advocating for child safety. Case 10. Henrietta Stone. Circuit Court. Plea Agreement early 2024. Crime occurred June 28, 2016. The tragedy of Shaylin Lahano Stone's death in 2016 would take nearly 8 years to reach legal resolution. When emergency responders arrived at Henrietta Stone's residence on June 28, 2016, they found 9-year-old Shaylin unresponsive. The girl was rushed to the hospital but could not be saved. She was pronounced dead, and the medical examiner's findings would reveal a horrific truth. Shaylin had essentially starved to death under her grandmother's care, her body so depleted of nutrition that her organs had failed. 9 years old. 4th grade age. Shaylin should have been thinking about school friends, favorite subjects, summer activities. Instead, she'd spent her final months wasting away, her body consuming itself in the absence of adequate food. The medical examiner documented severe malnutrition, a body weight far below healthy range, and physical evidence of prolonged nutritional deprivation. This wasn't a recent development, but a pattern that had likely continued for months or longer. Henrietta Stone, Shaylin's grandmother and legal guardian, became the focus of the investigation. How had a child died of starvation in her care? What had prevented her from feeding this little girl? Were there other children in the home who'd also been deprived? The investigation expanded to answer these questions, examining the household, interviewing anyone who'd had contact with the family, and building a timeline of Shaylin's decline. The case was complicated by questions about Stone's own capacity and circumstances. Was she herself struggling with resources? Had she sought help and been denied? Or had she willfully withheld food from Shaylin while feeding herself and potentially other family members? The distinction between inability to provide care and willful neglect would be crucial in determining appropriate charges and potential defenses. In the years following Shaylin's death, the case wound through the criminal justice system. Evidence was gathered, charges were filed, and legal proceedings began. But it wasn't until early 2024, nearly 8 years after Shaylin died, that the case reached final resolution. Henrietta Stone entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter charges, accepting criminal responsibility for her granddaughter's death without admitting specific facts about what occurred. The no-contest plea, while legally equivalent to a guilty plea for sentencing purposes, allowed Stone to avoid a trial where the full details of Shaylin's suffering would have been presented to a jury. For some family members, this was a relief, sparing them from reliving the trauma in a public courtroom. For others, it felt like an incomplete accounting, leaving questions unanswered about exactly what happened during Shaylin's final months. The sentencing hearing in 2024 finally brought some closure. The judge imposed a sentence reflecting the severity of allowing a child to starve to death, though legal guidelines and Stone's specific circumstances shaped the ultimate punishment. Whether that meant prison time, probation, or some combination depended on factors including Stone's age, health, criminal history, and the court's assessment of both accountability and the purpose of punishment for someone who'd likely spend their remaining years dealing with consequences of this case. For Shaylin's other family members, particularly her biological parents who'd entrusted her to Stone's care, the guilt and grief were overwhelming. They believed she would be safe with her grandmother. They trusted that family placement meant she'd be protected and loved. Instead, she'd suffered terribly and died in circumstances that should never happen to any child. The betrayal of that trust compounded their mourning. The 8-year gap between Shaylin's death and final legal resolution raised questions about the justice system's pace. Why had it taken so long to bring the case to conclusion? Were there evidentiary challenges? Did Stone's legal maneuvers delay proceedings? Were court resources so strained that cases moved this slowly? Whatever the reasons, the delay meant Shaylin's family waited nearly a decade for accountability, a secondary trauma on top of their loss. Child advocates use Shaylin's case to highlight failures in the kinship care system. When children are placed with relatives rather than strangers, there's often less oversight, fewer home visits, less monitoring. The assumption is that family will provide better, more loving care than the foster system. But Shaylin's case proved that blood relation doesn't guarantee safety, that grandparents and other relatives can be just as capable of abuse and neglect as anyone else. The medical evidence in Shaylin's case was particularly damning. Starvation doesn't happen overnight. Her body would have shown progressive signs of malnutrition over weeks and months. She would have become increasingly weak, lethargic, unable to perform normal activities. Anyone with regular contact with her should have noticed her deteriorating condition. That no one intervened before it was too late represented multiple system failures. Questions arose about whether Shaylin had been in school at the time of her death. If so, why hadn't teachers noticed her weight loss and weakness? If not, why wasn't school attendance being monitored? Truancy and educational neglect often overlap with other forms of abuse, as parents or guardians isolate children to hide evidence of maltreatment. Shaylin's case likely prompted reviews of attendance policies and mandatory reporting practices in her school district. Medical professionals were also scrutinized. Had Shaylin been taken for wellness visits? If so, how had severe malnutrition not been detected? If she hadn't seen a doctor in months, why hadn't that triggered concerns from Child Protective Services or other oversight agencies? Every case of fatal child abuse reveals gaps in the safety net, missed opportunities where intervention might have saved a life. Henrietta Stone's no contest plea meant accepting legal responsibility without providing a full accounting of why she'd let Shaylin starve. Did she lack resources to buy food? The investigation likely determined whether that was plausible or whether food was available but withheld from Shaylin specifically. Did Stone have cognitive or mental health issues that impaired her judgment? Forensic evaluations might have addressed her competency to stand trial and her mental state at the time of the offense. The sentencing phase allowed Shaylin's family to provide victim impact statements, sharing with the court how her death had devastated them. These statements gave voice to grief that had been carried for 8 years, allowed them to speak directly about what Shaylin's life meant and what her loss had cost. While no sentence could restore her life or truly ease their pain, the process of being heard in court provided some measure of acknowledgement. For the community where Shaylin lived and died, her case served as a painful reminder that child abuse often hides in plain sight. Neighbors who might have seen her occasionally, who perhaps noticed she seemed thin or quiet, now wondered if they should have done more. The collective responsibility for protecting children means everyone must be willing to speak up when something seems wrong, even when it's uncomfortable or uncertain. Shaylin's death in 2016 and the eventual resolution in 2024 bookend nearly a decade of grief, legal proceedings, and incomplete justice. Her short life ended in a way no child should suffer, and the years-long wait for accountability added to the trauma for those who loved her. Her case stands among the most tragic examples of how children slip through the cracks, how systems fail, and how preventable deaths nonetheless occur. The legacy of Shaylin Lahano Stone should be strengthened protections for children in kinship care, better monitoring of vulnerable children regardless of who's caring for them, and a community commitment to speaking up when children appear to be at risk. Every case teaches lessons, if we're willing to learn them, if we're committed to doing better for the next child who needs protection. Shaylin deserved so much better than the life and death she experienced. Her memory calls us to vigilance, to advocacy, to never looking away when children need help. If her story moves you to action, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Together, we can shine light on these tragedies and work toward preventing future ones.